This happened last October, on a Saturday night, right before Halloween. Me and my friends decided to hit up this Halloween party at a guy's house that one of us knew from work. I didn't know the host personally, but he was cool with us crashing, and the place was packed when we got there. It was your typical Halloween vibe: pumpkins on the porch, fake cobwebs everywhere, loud music, people in all kinds of costumes. I wasn't really feeling it at first. I had on a lazy vampire costume, just some fake teeth and a cape, nothing crazy. My friends went all out though. Tom dressed as Michael Myers, and Sarah went as a zombie bride. There were so many people in masks, I couldn't even tell who was who after a while. Anyway, we're there for about an hour, just drinking and talking in the kitchen, when this guy walks in. He's wearing a hospital gown and has these plastic handcuffs hanging off his wrists. His hair's all messy, and he's got dark circles under his eyes like he hasn't slept in days. At first, I thought it was a decent costume. Kind of creepy, but nothing special. The guy was acting weird, though, like he wasn't talking to anyone, just standing in the corner, watching people. And not like in a shy guy at a party way, more like he was studying people. I tried not to think much of it, but Sarah leaned over to me and whispered that the guy was giving her the creeps. I was starting to feel it too. Then he starts walking through the party, bumping into people like he doesn't care. At one point, he grabbed this girl's arm, really hard, and she yanked it away. She gave him this look like, "What the hell?" but then just laughed it off, probably thinking it was all part of his act. But it felt off. A couple of hours pass, and this dude is still hanging around, but now he's getting in people's faces, making weird comments. One guy asked him what he was supposed to be, and the guy just stared at him for a solid 10 seconds before saying,
"You wouldn't believe me if I told you."
Then things started getting really messed up. At some point, the host's dog, a big German shepherd, starts barking like crazy from the backyard. We all thought maybe someone was messing with it or something, but the barking wouldn't stop. A couple of people went outside to check, but when they came back in, they looked kind of freaked out. They said they saw someone running through the yard, but it was too dark to see who it was. Then, not even 5 minutes later, all the power in the house cuts out. Music stops, lights go out, and suddenly we're all standing in pitch black darkness. I could hear people freaking out, stumbling around to find their phones or a flashlight. Someone said it was probably just a blown fuse, but I had this bad feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right. People were using their phones as flashlights, and that's when I saw him again, the hospital gown guy, just standing there, in the middle of the living room, dead still. No phone in his hand, no nothing. He wasn't even moving. He was just staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, not blinking. Someone yelled, "Hey man, that's enough. The joke's over." But he didn't move. Not an inch. The host, he was this big guy, not someone you'd mess with, finally steps up and walks over to him, telling him to leave if he's going to keep acting like a creep. But the guy doesn't say a word. He just turns his head, slowly, to look at the host, then he starts laughing. Not a normal laugh, though. It was this deep, guttural sound, like he was forcing it out, but nothing about it felt funny. Next thing we know, the guy pulls out a freaking knife, a real one. It wasn't one of those plastic props people had. This thing was shining in the light of everyone's phones, and that's when the panic started. People were screaming, pushing each other to get out of the way. The host tried to grab him, but the guy was quick. He slashed at him, and the host stumbled back, holding his arm. That's when all hell broke loose. Everyone rushed for the doors, but it was a madhouse. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get out as fast as they could. I remember grabbing Sarah's hand and dragging her towards the kitchen, where there was a side door. We could still hear the dog barking like crazy outside, and in all the chaos, the guy was just walking after us like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't even running, just following. We managed to get out of the house and ran to the front yard, but we weren't safe yet. People were still screaming inside, and when I looked back, the guy was just standing at the door, watching everyone leave. He didn't follow us outside, but that creepy grin on his face was burned into my brain. It felt like hours before the cops finally showed up. but it was probably only a few minutes. When they got inside, the guy was gone. Vanished. They searched the house and the backyard, but there was no sign of him. Later, we found out that the guy wasn't just some partygoer with a weird sense of humor. He was an actual patient who had escaped from a mental health facility about 30 miles away earlier that day. They said he was dangerous, but no one had seen him since. I don't know what his plan was or why he came to that party, but I can't stop thinking about how close we all were to something a lot worse happening. I won't be going to any Halloween parties this year. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood surrounded by woods. It's peaceful most of the time, but nights like this make me uneasy. It was one of those stormy fall nights with the rain pounding hard enough to make it sound like someone's outside. I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and I figured it would just be a chill night of binge-watching TV and ignoring the weather. Around 10 p.m., just as I was settling in, the power went out. The whole house went dark, and for a second, I thought maybe the storm had knocked something out. It wasn't unusual for the power to flicker during bad weather, but it never went out like this. My heart started racing a little. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I figured I'd just wait it out, but the silence in the house, broken only by the sound of the storm, made everything feel off. A few minutes passed, and I heard it. A knock on the front door. Not a loud banging, but a steady, deliberate knock. My first thought was that it was a neighbor coming to check on me or something, but why would anyone be out in this storm? I checked the time, 10:15 p.m., way too late for a friendly visit. I hesitated, but decided to go see who it was. My phone light guided me through the dark house as I made my way to the door. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind and rain were so loud it was hard to focus, but then there it was again, 3 slow knocks. My stomach dropped. I leaned up to the peephole, and what I saw chilled me to the core. A man was standing there, drenched from the rain, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing completely still, facing the door. I didn't recognize him, and something about the way he stood there so still made me feel sick. I backed away from the door slowly, not wanting to make a sound. As I stepped back, the knocking stopped. My heart was pounding now, and I quickly debated what to do. Maybe he would go away. Maybe he thought no one was home. But then I heard the doorknob jiggle. I froze. Whoever this guy was, he was trying to get in. I knew I couldn't just stand there. So I moved as quietly as I could down the hall and into the bathroom. It was the only room in the house with a lock that felt somewhat secure. Once inside, I locked the door and sat on the floor, trying to control my breathing. I kept my phone in my hand, and my thumb hovered over the call 911 button, but something stopped me. It was like my brain couldn't process that this was really happening. Maybe he'd give up and leave. For a few minutes, all I heard was the storm outside. It was almost enough to convince me that he was gone, but then I heard it, a creak from the floorboards in the hallway. He was inside the house. I stifled a gasp, clamping my hand over my mouth. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. The bathroom window was too small to crawl through, and I had no way of knowing where he was in the house. I couldn't hear his footsteps, just the occasional soft creak of the floor. It was like he was purposely trying to be quiet, stalking through the house. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. It felt like hours. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang rattled the bathroom door. I jumped, barely managing to keep from screaming. He knew I was in here. He had to. The door rattled again, this time harder, followed by a deep, low voice. "I know you're in there," the man said. My blood ran cold. He pounded on the door harder, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. In a panic, I grabbed the shower rod and yanked it down, holding it like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The door pounded again, and this time it started to splinter. I had to do something. I had to get out. I threw open the bathroom window, the cold, wet wind slapping me in the face. I knew there was no way I'd fit through it, but I stuck my arm out and waved it, hoping someone, anyone, might see me. My only other option was to make a run for it. The moment the door broke, I would have to fight or escape. The door burst open, and in the dim light of my phone, I saw him, tall, soaked, and smiling in the most twisted way I've ever seen. I didn't wait. I swung the shower rod at him as hard as I could, hitting him in the side of the head. He grunted, stumbling back just long enough for me to push past him and sprint down the hallway. I didn't stop. I bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running barefoot into the storm. The cold rain felt like needles against my skin, but I didn't care. I ran to my neighbor's house, screaming for help. By some miracle, they were home. They opened the door, and I collapsed inside, shaking and sobbing. I tried to tell them what happened, but I could barely get the words out. They called the police, who arrived within minutes, but by the time they got to my house, the man was gone. The cops never found him. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. But I know what happened. I still can't explain it, but I know that man was real, and if I hadn't gotten out when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. This happened last week, when my girlfriend Emily and I decided to visit a pumpkin patch just outside of town. We loved the fall season, and picking out the perfect pumpkin was one of our favorite traditions. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields as we arrived. The place was bustling with families and couples, all eager to find their own piece of autumn. We wandered through the rows of pumpkins, laughing and joking about which ones were too lopsided or too small. It was a perfect evening, or so we thought. As we made our way to the far end of the patch, I noticed a man standing alone near the edge of the field. He was tall and wore a long, dark coat that seemed out of place among the cheerful crowd. His eyes followed us as we moved through the pumpkins, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just another customer, but as we continued to explore, I could tell that he was watching us. Emily noticed it too and whispered to me, "Do you see that guy? He's been staring at us for a while now." We decided to ignore him and continued picking out our pumpkins, but every time I glanced in his direction, he was still there, watching us with an unsettling intensity. As the sky darkened and the patch began to empty out, we decided it was time to head home. We paid for our pumpkins and made our way to the car. As we were loading them into the trunk, I saw him again, standing by his car in the parking lot, still watching us. Feeling uneasy, we quickly got into our car and drove off. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting him to follow us. At first, there was no sign of him, and I began to relax. But then, just as we turned onto the main road, headlights appeared behind us. I tried to convince myself it was just another car heading home from the patch. But when we made a series of right turns to test if he was following us, he mirrored every move. My heart started pounding. Emily looked at me with wide eyes. "What should we do?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. Suddenly, the car behind us started flashing its lights repeatedly. It was him. There was no doubt about it now. "Don't stop," Emily urged. "Just keep driving." I nodded and pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to put some distance between us and our pursuer. We took random turns through unfamiliar neighborhoods, hoping to lose him in the maze of streets. After what felt like an eternity of driving in circles, his headlights finally disappeared from view. We both let out a sigh of relief as we made our way back home. Once inside our apartment, we double-checked that all the doors were locked and tried to calm down. We sat on the couch in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. About 30 minutes later, just as we were starting to relax again, there was a loud knock at the door. We both froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Who could that be?" Emily whispered. I got up slowly and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, my heart skipped a beat. It was him, The man from the pumpkin patch stood on our doorstep, looking more menacing than ever. I backed away from the door and whispered urgently to Emily, "It's him." Her eyes widened in fear as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Meanwhile, I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and moved back toward the door. The knocking continued, louder this time, and then stopped suddenly. We held our breath as we listened for any signs of movement outside. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for help to arrive. Finally, we heard sirens approaching in the distance. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but found no trace of him. We filed a report and gave them all the details we could remember about his appearance and behavior at the pumpkin patch. They promised to keep an eye out for him, but warned us that he might not be easy to find without more information. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. Every creak or rustle outside made me jumpy and paranoid. It took weeks before I could sleep soundly again without imagining those piercing eyes watching me from the shadows. We never went back to that pumpkin patch, or any other, for fear of encountering him again. To this day, I still wonder who he was and what he wanted with us, or what he planned on doing to us.